Welcome to the study of Ezra Nehemiah. Here are the steps that we'll take as we engage this study. We'll look over the historical context, the literary context, and finally the theological context. Let's begin with the historical context. It's very important to appreciate that within the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, there are two distinct eras that are presented. The first, that appears in Ezra 1 through 6, is not the era of the person for whom the book is named. Rather, what we find in Ezra 1 through 6 is the chronicle of events that took place a number of years before Ezra's own ministry. So please turn your attention to the column on the left, Returning Exiles, the first major block of information. And this will summarize for us what's going on in Ezra chapters 1 through 6. We're calling this the initial waves of returning exiles. Sometimes it's simply called the first return of exiles, but as we study it very closely, there was more than one. They happened fairly soon after Cyrus, and that would be Cyrus II, who you see on the right-hand column under Persian kings. As soon as Cyrus II issued what's come to be called the Edict of Restoration, that is permission for foreigners that he had inherited from the Babylonians when he overtook the Babylonian Empire. These were in essence prisoners of war, persons that had been forcibly dislocated, not only Israelites, but certainly including Israelites, in particular Judeans, people from the southern kingdom. So once again, here's what's going on in Ezra 1 through 6. We begin with a description of the first waves, the initial waves of returning exiles, ones who had been authorized by Cyrus II of Persia to go back to their homeland. Israelites were not the only ones that were given this permission, but they, for biblical purposes, are, of course, the focal group. Some 48 years had transpired after Jerusalem had been demolished in 587 BC, until in 538, Cyrus, in the first year of his reign after overtaking the Babylonian Empire, his rule, he was a king, he was a monarch in Anshan prior to that. You can see the date of 559, but it wasn't until 538 that his rule overtook the Babylonian Empire. And 1 year into that period, 538, he gives permission for people to return to their homelands. It's worth observing, if you haven't registered this already, not everyone took him up on the offer. Once again, not all the Israelites who had been dislocated to Babylonia and then became Persia, part of the Persian Empire, not all of them wanted to leave. They had become settled. We might think of it in terms of having followed Jeremiah's exhortation to seek the welfare of the city where they are dislocated to. And they did, and they became rooted. We learn about these communities in part through the religious information that's been passed down from the Jewish communities. Perhaps you've heard of something called the Babylonian Talmud. It's Babylonian because it came from the community of Babylon, Jewish people who resided in Babylon and stayed there, and yet they developed a Talmud, a very important Jewish religious document. All right, let's direct our attention then back to the left-hand column, and we see that Ezra 1 through 6 then chronicles the return of these people, and the primary project that they engage in is rebuilding the temple there at Jerusalem, the spiritual epicenter. Its importance, as you may have discovered in studying some of the prophetic books already, its importance is not simply a piece of architecture, but it's the place where their ceremonies can get them in touch with God, where they can focus on God and walk in His ways, a place where God said He would particularly connect with the people as they interact with Him in the ways that He had prescribed. The rebuilding of the temple was authorized by Cyrus of Persia. He didn't simply say, go home. He said, go home, and you are authorized to actually build that structure. The individuals that we find leading this return, first a governor, this would be an Israelite by the name of Sheshbazzar. He fades into the background fairly soon, and overtaking him, or at least in the terms of prominence in the account, is Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel similarly is operating like a governor, as opposed to being either a prophet or a priest. So these are rather administrative, governmental leaders. Haggai and Zechariah are prophets that spur the people on with their exhortations. As you are no doubt aware, they have independent books in the Hebrew Bible going by their names. Their ministry spans 520 to 515, and that coincides with emerging from a dormancy, 520, a dormancy that was enforced by opposition, neighbors in the Judean area who were agitating against the returnees, saying, do not rebuild the temple. We find this offensive. It was interfering with their power structure. So there was a work stop that was politically enforced on the returnees. And finally, the returnees were able to work through that and resume building in the temple in 520. And that continued until counting down to 515 BC, when on March 12, rather remarkable that we know the actual day of the year when the temple was completed. So once again, that information is Ezra 1 through 6. It is prior to the actual ministry of Ezra, for whom the book is named. The balance of the material in Ezra and Nehemiah can be grouped under this next heading, later waves of returnees. Later waves. And they occur fairly closely together. Let's look at them in series. First, we have Ezra going from Babylon, making his way to Jerusalem. His return in 458 will take place 80 years after the earlier waves, the top bullet. So some 80 years have gone by since in 538, Cyrus II said, you're free to go back to your homelands. If we were to summarize the focus of Ezra's ministry, we could express it as rebuilding the community's religious life, and we'll come back to some of the things that he achieved and contributed later on. Let's direct our attention to the right-hand column for a bit, catching up on information provided under the Persian kings. We've already said Cyrus II was the one who in 538 issued the Edict of Restoration. He is followed in Persian monarchy by Cambyses and then Darius I. It will be under Darius I that there is a temporary halting of the temple rebuilding. Ezra is not on the scene yet. This is still with the first waves of Israelites coming out of Persia. Then it's recommenced, the temple building, as you see on the right, through Haggai and Zechariah's encouragement, leading to the completion of the temple. Darius I is followed by Xerxes I, who also goes by the name Ahasuerus. And Esther, her story then takes place during the reign of Ahasuerus. He is followed by Artaxerxes I, who also goes by the name of Longimanus, 465 to 424. Now we want to pause a bit with Artaxerxes I, because this is the Persian ruler who authorizes Ezra to go back to his homeland, to Jerusalem. That's authorized in 458 BC, which you can see plainly is right within that span of Artaxerxes I's reign, 465 to 424. So once again, a priest, an Israelite, a Jewish priest, well, he would be Levitical, but from the kingdom of southern Israel, residing in Babylon, makes his way back to Jerusalem in 458. The official authorization from the Persian monarch indicates that he's to go to Jerusalem, he's to teach the law, to instruct the people in how to live according to the religious law. That would be the Torah, the Pentateuch, and to engage in sacrifices, so to actively be involved in the religious ceremony, real core expression of the people's relationship with God. Now it will be that same Artaxerxes I who will also authorize Nehemiah. And in Nehemiah's case, the authorization is not go back, teach the law, and offer sacrifices, but rather you are authorized to rebuild the Jerusalem walls. So with that information, let's go and finish out the column on the left. We left off with Ezra rebuilding community's religious life, and now the last group of information indicates the rebuilding of the wall of Jerusalem then is the final piece of activity that is presented in the Ezra and Nehemiah books. 445 is when Nehemiah makes his way to Jerusalem. He is making his way from Susa, and that is happening 13 years after Ezra. Ezra 458, Nehemiah 445. So Ezra has already been operating in Jerusalem for over a decade before another countryman who was a trusted court official in the court of the Persian king Artaxerxes I. He makes his way 445 to Jerusalem. We don't have record of what Ezra was doing during those 13 years. When we read details about what his actual activities were, specifically organizing public reading from the Pentateuch, from the Law of Moses, these sorts of things, those are happening after Ezra arrives. So we have a bit of a silent period of Ezra's activity on site in Jerusalem before Nehemiah arrives. This is one copy of what's known as the Cyrus Cylinder. This particular copy is in the British Museum. You can't see it. It's wide open and accessible there in the wonderfully laid out collection that is a world treasure in London. This then presents the message of Cyrus saying to those members of his population who had been dislocated by the Babylonians, saying, "You are free now to go home." It is just a stellar archaeological recovery confirming a particular piece in the biblical history. It's often helpful when we have so many locations being referred to, helpful to take a look at where this is taking place. This particular atlas is from the Holman Bible Atlas, and you can see it referred to in white type there at the very bottom of your screen. It's coming through Logos Bible software, which is a great way to access resources of this sort. If we concentrate on the bluish or purple route, we'll see this would be what we called earlier the first waves of people returning from exile. And that would be the 538. This particular atlas dates it at 537. There's a year discrepancy depending on who's counting the years, but 538 is what we'll be following. So that is when Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel go back and they commence building the temple, and then there's interference. Then in 520, Haggai and Zechariah stir them up again with their exhortation, and the temple is completed in 515 BC. That's the purple route, as you see, obviously ending in Jerusalem. The red route presents to us then the travels of Ezra in 458. Ezra is beginning in Babylon, and it will be Nehemiah who is working in the capital at Susa, and he will make his way from Susa all the way to Jerusalem. We have an interesting piece of travel data relative to Ezra's trip. We learned that it took them about 4 months to go from Babylon to Jerusalem. You may find it helpful to draw from this list if you're interested in knowing what time of the year the various events transpired that are mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah. For example, we learn in Ezra 6, verse 15, that the Jerusalem temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. And that's how we were able to derive the date. You see Adar as the very bottom month, the 12th month in this calendar setup, corresponding to February, March, and it winds up then being in the late winter. The first month is when Passover is routinely celebrated, and we read of this in chapter 6 of Ezra, verse 19. So first month, not surprisingly, Passover should be a spring event corresponding to Easter, and there we find it in the March-April time frame. Ezra's trip is described in Ezra 7, the opening lines, first few verses, and we find that he began his trip in the first month, so he left in late winter, early spring, and arrived in the 5th month, and that would be Av in the July-August time frame. So feel free to refer back to this anytime you're reading through one of these books and are curious where in the calendar is a particular event taking place. Another graphic that you may find useful is this presentation of the various gates of Jerusalem at the time of Nehemiah. So for example, in Nehemiah 2, verse 11, Nehemiah makes his initial survey of the condition of the wall of Jerusalem. And it reads thus, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. Verse 13, by night I went out through the valley gate. You'll locate the valley gate there on the left side, about midway. And then we continue reading. He went toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, which is there due south, examining the walls of Jerusalem which had been broken down and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Verse 14, then I moved toward the Fountain Gate, so he's continuing in a counterclockwise fashion. He goes to the King's Pool, and then turns back in verse 15, re-entering through the Valley Gate. So we can picture what territory Nehemiah traversed in this nocturnal survey. In chapter 3 of Nehemiah, it will be the named gates that serve as reference points for segments of wall reconstruction performed by various individuals or groups of people. Chapter 3, verse 1, for example, in Nehemiah, here we learn that the sheep gate, which you see at the very top of the diagram, the sheep gate was rebuilt by members of the priesthood. Eliashiv, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100. And then they proceeded over to rebuild as far as the Tower of Hananel. And at that point, we find that the men of Jericho built the next section. The next video will continue with the literary context.